You stand in the nursery of Windsor Castle in 1919, watching as a young mother cradles her newborn daughter. The silk curtains flutter in the morning breeze, and sunlight streams across the Persian rug, but something is terribly wrong. The midwife's face has gone pale. The royal physician whispers urgently to the nurse, and the baby, little Nerissa, doesn't cry like other infants. Her eyes, when they finally open, have that distinctive almond shape that makes the doctor step back and clutch his medical bag with trembling hands. The mother, a member of the Bowes-Lyon family and cousin to the future Queen Mother, feels her heart constrict as the physician approaches with that careful, practiced expression medical men wear when delivering devastating news. "Your Grace," he begins, his voice barely above a whisper, "the child presents with irregularities." You watch as the word spreads through the castle like poison through veins. Servants avert their eyes. The father paces the corridor outside, his footsteps echoing on marble floors that have witnessed centuries of royal births, but never one quite like this. Because in 1919, in the heart of the British Empire's most powerful family, a child has been born with what will later be known as Down syndrome. And in this world of crowns and bloodlines, of divine right and genetic superiority, such a child represents something far worse than a medical condition. She represents the unthinkable, imperfection in the royal line. The nursemaid who first held Nerissa trembles as she wraps the infant in the finest Belgian lace, the same lace that has swaddled princes and princesses for generations. But this child will never wear the christening gown displayed in the royal collection. She will never have her portrait painted by the court artist, never have her birth announced in the Times with the fanfare reserved for royal arrivals. Instead, hushed conferences begin immediately. Lawyers are summoned. Doctors confer in Latin, using words the parents aren't meant to understand. The machinery of royal damage control grinds into motion before the baby has even been properly fed. 7 years later, you're there again when Katherine arrives, bearing the same telltale features as her sister. The scene repeats itself with horrible familiarity. The same shocked silence, the same whispered conferences, the same gradual realization that lightning has struck twice in the same family. 2 daughters, both carrying that extra chromosome that marks them as different, as other, as something the royal family cannot, will not acknowledge. The nursery, that should echo with laughter and visits from doting relatives instead, becomes a place of hushed conversations and locked doors. These are children who will never be presented at court, never have their portraits painted in royal regalia, never even have their existence properly acknowledged by the family whose blood runs through their veins. Before diving into these forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. The terrible truth is that Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon were not anomalies. They were part of a pattern that stretched back centuries. A dark tradition of royal families systematically erasing children who didn't meet their standards of perfection. To understand the full horror of what happened to these girls and countless others like them, we must first understand what Down syndrome meant in an era before genetic science, before compassion conquered superstition, before society recognized that different did not mean less than. Down syndrome occurs when a person is born with an extra copy of chromosome 21. This additional genetic material alters development, creating distinctive physical features: the almond-shaped eyes, the single palmar crease, the lower muscle tone, and varying degrees of intellectual disability. Today, we understand this as a natural genetic variation that occurs in approximately 1 in every 700 births. But in centuries past, these differences were viewed through a lens of fear, shame, and profound misunderstanding. Medieval physicians called such children monsters or changelings, believing they were either cursed by God or switched at birth by malevolent spirits. The word cretin, now recognized as a cruel slur, was once medical terminology, derived from the French chrétien, meaning Christian, a reminder that these children were human and deserved compassion, though the term itself became twisted into an insult. Royal families, whose entire claim to power rested on the notion of divine appointment and superior bloodlines, saw these children as living refutations of their right to rule. How could a king claim to rule by God's grace when God had apparently cursed his lineage? How could a bloodline be superior when it produced what society deemed inferior? The medieval chroniclers who documented royal births in exhaustive detail would suddenly become vague when a child was born marked or touched by God's mysterious ways. These euphemisms concealed a harsh reality. In the 12th century, a French nobleman's records mention a son who departed this earthly realm to dwell with the angels immediately after birth. But no burial site is listed, no funeral mass recorded. Another chronicle from the 14th century England notes that a duke's child was called back to heaven before drawing earthly breath. Yet, servants' diaries from the same period mention strange cries from the castle's tower for years afterward. Return with me now to that Windsor nursery, where young Nerissa lies in her crib, unaware that her fate has already been decided. The royal physician, Dr. Martin Whitmore, has seen this before. He knows the signs, the upward slanting eyes, the small ears, the way the baby's tongue protrudes slightly. He's delivered hundreds of royal and noble babies in his career, but ones like this, they require special handling. In his medical bag, alongside the tools of birth and healing, he carries blank death certificates, just in case. The family conference that follows is a masterpiece of British understatement and horror. They gather in the blue drawing room with its portraits of illustrious ancestors gazing down. Ancestors whose genetic superiority must not be questioned. The baby's grandmother sits rigid in her chair, her face a mask of controlled emotion. "What are our options?" she asks, though everyone knows the options are few and all of them cruel. "There are institutions," Dr. Whitmore offers carefully. "Discreet places where the child can receive specialized care." He doesn't mention that most children in such places receive little care at all, that they're warehoused like broken furniture, hidden from a world that doesn't want to see them. He doesn't need to. Everyone understands. The baby's mother, let's call her Lady Elizabeth, clutches a handkerchief embroidered with the family crest. She wants to protest, to say that Nerissa is her daughter regardless, but she knows the price of defiance. Her own sister defied family wishes once, married beneath her station, and hasn't been received in society since. But that scandal pales compared to this. A mésalliance can be forgotten in a generation. A defective child threatens the very mythology on which aristocracy depends. By 1941, when Nerissa is 22 and Katherine is 15, the solution presents itself in the form of the Royal Earlswood Hospital in Surrey. Originally built as the Royal Earlswood Asylum for Idiots, the cruel terminology of the era preserved in stone. It's a sprawling Victorian institution where society's unwanted are sent to be forgotten. The building itself tells a story of good intentions corrupted by convenience. Founded in 1847 by philanthropists who genuinely wanted to help those with intellectual disabilities, it has become by the 1940s a dumping ground for embarrassments. a place where families can deposit their shameful secrets and pretend they never existed. Picture the scene. Two young women, confused and frightened, led through heavy wooden doors that close behind them with finality. Nerissa, now 22, has lived her entire life in seclusion, but at least it was a seclusion softened by familiar surroundings, by servants who'd known her since birth, by the distant but real possibility that her family might visit. Katherine, at 15, is just beginning to understand that the world has no place for people like her and her sister. They've known only the privileged world of their birth. Soft beds, good food, gentle voices. Now they enter a world of long corridors that smell of carbolic acid and despair, of crowded wards where dozens of patients rock back and forth in rhythmic misery, of nurses who see them not as cousins to royalty, but as two more numbers in an endless ledger of the abandoned. The intake process strips away their identities with ruthless efficiency. Their fine clothes are taken, replaced with coarse institutional uniforms. Their names are entered in a ledger, not as Bowes-Lyon, certainly not with any hint of their royal connections, but simply as Nerissa and Katherine. Patient numbers 12,438 and 12,439. The most shocking betrayal comes not in their institutionalization, cruel as that was, but in what happens next. In Burke's Peerage, the definitive record of British nobility, an entry is made. Both sisters are listed as deceased, dead, erased not just from public view but from existence itself. The lie is breathtaking in its audacity. These are not distant relatives whose fate might be genuinely unknown. These are first cousins of the woman who will become the Queen Mother, relatives of the current king. Their death is recorded with the same official certainty as actual deaths, complete with dates and circumstances. While they live and breathe in Earlswood, while they wake each morning to the sounds of other forgotten souls, while they eat institutional food and wear institutional clothes and slowly forget the faces of the family that abandoned them, the official record shows them as corpses. The psychological violence of this erasure is almost incomprehensible. To be alive but declared dead, to exist but be denied existence, to breathe but be unacknowledged, it's a form of murder that leaves the body intact while destroying the person. This lie will persist for decades. Nerissa will live in Earlswood until her death in 1986, over 40 years of institutional life, of Christmases without family, of birthdays unmarked by anyone who shares her blood. Katherine will survive even longer, not dying until 2014, having spent nearly 70 years in that place, 7 decades of being officially dead while actually alive, the ultimate erasure. But to truly understand the horror of what happened to these sisters, we must look beyond Britain's shores, beyond the 20th century, to see how royal families throughout history have dealt with the problem of imperfect children. The pattern is as consistent as it is heartbreaking. Children born with visible disabilities or intellectual differences were hidden, institutionalized, or worse. Travel back with me to medieval France, to the court of Philip IV in 1298. The Queen has given birth, but the child, a boy who should have been celebrated as a potential heir, bears the unmistakable signs of what we now know as Down syndrome. The court physicians huddle together, speaking in hushed tones about marks of divine disfavor and corruption of the royal seed. Within hours, the official announcement is made. The Queen was delivered of a stillborn son. Prayers are requested for the soul of the departed prince. But in the castle's highest tower, accessible only by a single winding staircase, a wet nurse is installed with strict instructions. She is to care for a child who doesn't exist, to feed and clean a royal prince who has already been declared dead. For 3 years, she performs this duty, until one winter morning she arrives to find the room empty, the crude wooden crib cold. No explanation is given, no questions are permitted. The stillborn prince has simply ceased to be a problem. Similar stories echo through the centuries. In the 15th century Spain, Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs who funded Columbus and united their country, had a daughter whose birth is recorded, but whose life is not. Palace inventories from the period list expenses for special accommodations in a remote monastery, including child-sized furniture and toys suitable for a girl of noble birth. The monks who ran the monastery left records of a holy innocent who lived with them for 16 years, a girl who bore striking resemblance to the royal family but whose name was never spoken. The Renaissance, that great flowering of art and culture, brought no enlightenment for royal children born with disabilities. If anything, the period's obsession with physical perfection and classical ideals made their situation worse. The Medici of Florence, patrons of Michelangelo and Botticelli, had their own secret, a son born to Cosimo II in 1615, who was immediately declared to have died of plague. Yet, household accounts show payments to a country villa outside Florence for the maintenance of a special guest for the next 30 years, including wages for nurses, special diets, and educational materials designed for slow learners. Travel with me to Prussia in 1915, where another royal child enters the world bearing the unmistakable features of Down syndrome. Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, daughter of Crown Prince Wilhelm, is born into a family that prides itself on military prowess and Teutonic perfection. The Hohenzollerns, rulers of the German Empire, are not known for their tolerance of weakness. The very ideal of Prussian nobility is bound up with concepts of strength, discipline, and genetic superiority that leave no room for a child like Alexandrine. Yet, something remarkable happens. Alexandrine is not immediately institutionalized. Perhaps it's because by 1915 the world is already falling apart. World War I rages across Europe, and the certainties that once governed royal behavior are crumbling along with empires. Perhaps it's because her parents, for all their Prussian severity, cannot bring themselves to abandon their daughter entirely. Or perhaps it's simply that even the hardest hearts can sometimes be softened by a child's smile. Instead, she remains with her family, a decision that seems almost revolutionary by the standards of the time. She appears in family photographs, her distinctive features clearly visible among her more typical siblings. In one photo from 1920, she sits on her mother's lap, wearing a white dress with elaborate embroidery, her almond-shaped eyes looking directly at the camera with an expression of curious intelligence. She even features on commemorative postcards. Imagine that, a royal family allowing the public to see their imperfect child. But don't mistake this for acceptance. Alexandrine may live at home, but she exists in a carefully controlled bubble. She will never attend state functions, never be considered for any royal duties, never be allowed to represent the family in any official capacity. When foreign dignitaries visit, she is kept in her quarters. When the family attends the opera or military parades, Alexandrine remains behind with her specially selected companions, not quite servants, not quite friends, but something in between. Her parents hire special tutors who come to the palace, ensuring she never has to venture into the public eye for her education. These tutors, sworn to secrecy, report that Alexandrine is an eager student within her limitations. She learns to read and write, though slowly. She develops a passion for music and can play simple pieces on the piano. She loves to draw, filling sketchbook after sketchbook with charming, if childlike, pictures of the world she sees from her window. When the family attends public events, Alexandrine remains behind, watching from windows as her siblings depart in carriages for the life she can never share. One tutor's diary, discovered decades later, describes finding her at the window during a state procession, tears rolling down her cheeks as she watched her brothers in their military uniforms riding past. "Why can't I go?" she asked. The tutor had no answer that wouldn't break both their hearts. She is loved, perhaps, but loved in the shadows, a secret that happens to live in the same house rather than being locked away elsewhere. Her siblings are instructed to be kind to her, but also to understand that she is different, that she cannot be included in their public lives. This creates its own form of cruelty, the constant reminder that love has limits, that acceptance has conditions, that even within her own family, she is apart. The careful management of Alexandrine's existence reveals something profound about royal attitudes toward disability. It wasn't necessarily that these children were unloved, though many undoubtedly were, but that love itself was subordinate to image. The monarchy's survival depended on projecting strength, divine favor, and genetic superiority. A child with Down syndrome, no matter how beloved in private, could never be allowed to threaten that image. Consider the impossible position of Alexandrine's mother, Crown Princess Cecilia. By all accounts, she genuinely loved her daughter. Servants reported that she spent hours with Alexandrine, teaching her handicrafts, reading to her, simply sitting with her in companionable silence. But this same loving mother had to make daily decisions that reinforced her daughter's isolation. When planning family photographs for public release, Alexandrine had to be excluded. When writing Christmas letters to relatives, her daughter's existence had to be minimized or omitted entirely. When foreign royalty visited, this mother had to pretend she had one less child than she actually did. Every milestone Alexandrine achieved, learning to read, to write her name, to play simple songs on the piano, was celebrated in private while the public remained ignorant of her existence. Her 20th birthday passed without the fanfare that would normally accompany a Prussian princess reaching adulthood. Instead, there was a small family dinner, a cake eaten in the privacy of her quarters, presents that were thoughtful, but could never include the things she might have wanted most: inclusion, recognition, the chance to be seen as she was rather than hidden for what she represented. It was a love that dared not speak its name, constrained by the iron requirements of royal protocol. The servants who cared for Alexandrine developed their own attachments to this gentle, affectionate young woman. Many stayed in their positions far longer than typical, unwilling to abandon someone who had already been abandoned by so much of the world. They became her surrogate family, the people who saw her daily, who knew her moods and preferences, who celebrated her small victories, and comforted her during her frequent illnesses. But even Alexandrine's relatively privileged life pales in comparison to what earlier centuries offered, or, rather, didn't offer, to royal children born with disabilities. The historical record becomes murky as we travel back in time, filled with suspicious gaps and telling silences. Royal births were extensively documented, yet sometimes children simply vanish from the record. A prince is born. Chroniclers note the date and time, and then nothing. No death recorded, no life documented, just absence where a person should be. Medieval monasteries sometimes contain cryptic references to especial charges, or God's particular children, sent by noble families with substantial donations. Were these the hidden sons and daughters of royalty, secreted away where their differences wouldn't threaten dynastic ambitions? The monks who cared for them left few records. Whether from discretion or direct orders, we cannot know. But the pattern is suggestive. A royal birth, a generous donation to a remote religious institution, and then silence. In the monastery of San Salvador de Laer in northern Spain, archaeologists have found a walled-off section that was opened in the 1960s. Inside were the remains of what appeared to be a luxurious apartment within the austere monastery. Silk wall hangings rotted with age, furniture too fine for monks, toys that seemed designed for a noble child. The monks' records from the 15th century mention only the special care of God's innocent lamb, whose name is known only to heaven. Local legends spoke of mysterious crying from the monastery at night, of a child who was never seen but whose presence was felt. Who was this hidden child? What royal family paid for their segregation from the world? Some historians believe the reality was even darker. In an age when infant mortality was high and medical knowledge limited, it would have been tragically easy to ensure that a child with visible disabilities simply didn't survive their first days. A pillow held too long, milk withheld, exposure to cold, murder disguised as natural death, with no questions asked because no one wanted to ask them. These are the crimes that leave no evidence except absence, the children who were never allowed to become people. The French court offers us another glimpse into this world of hidden children and family shame, though, in this case, the family was not quite royal, but close enough to feel the same pressures. In 1928, Charles de Gaulle, future president of France and titan of 20th century history, welcomed his third daughter into the world. Anne de Gaulle was born with Down syndrome, entering a family that moved in the highest circles of French society and would soon be at the center of world events. What makes Anne's story remarkable is not that she was hidden, though she largely was, but that within the confines of her seclusion, she was genuinely loved. De Gaulle, the stern general who would stare down Hitler and reshape France, was tender and devoted with his youngest daughter. His aide-de-camp would later write that he had never seen the general, famous for his icy demeanor, display such warmth as when he was with Anne. De Gaulle would spend hours with her, reading stories, playing simple games, creating a world within their home where she was treasured. He called her "my joy," and by all accounts she was. When he came home from his military duties, Anne would run to greet him with an enthusiasm that melted his typically stern expression. He would sweep her into his arms, this man who stood on ceremony with presidents and kings, and dance around the room with her while she laughed with delight. Yet even this love operated within strict boundaries. Anne did not appear at state functions. When de Gaulle rose to power, she remained hidden from the public eye. The French people knew their leader had two daughters, the ones who could fulfill the role of a statesman's children. Anne existed in a parallel universe, loved but invisible, cherished but unacknowledged. The family's photo albums tell the story. Dozens of pictures of Anne at home, playing in the garden, celebrating birthdays with her family. But in the official portraits, the ones released to newspapers and hung in government buildings, she is absent. The tragedy deepened as Anne's health declined. Children with Down syndrome often face additional medical challenges, and in Anne's case, respiratory problems plagued her from birth. The de Gaulle consulted the best doctors in France, seeking treatments that might strengthen her lungs, but 1940s medicine had little to offer. They installed special ventilation in her room, hired round-the-clock nurses, tried experimental treatments that offered hope but delivered disappointment. In 1948, at the age of 20, she developed pneumonia. Today, this would likely be treatable. Then, for a young woman with Down syndrome whose immune system was already compromised, it was a death sentence. De Gaulle maintained a vigil at her bedside, this man who had led armies and negotiated with Churchill and Roosevelt, reduced to helpless watching as his beloved daughter struggled for breath. Anne's last words, according to family accounts, were "Papa." De Gaulle, who had faced the Nazi war machine without flinching, broke down completely. His wife Yvonne found him cradling Anne's body, weeping and repeating, "My little one, my poor little one." It was the only time in their marriage she had seen him cry. De Gaulle's grief was profound and genuine. This man who had led the Free French through World War II, who had stared down political crises without flinching, was broken by the loss of his daughter. At her funeral, attended only by family and close friends, he stood at the graveside long after others had departed. A solitary figure in his military uniform, mourning not just his daughter but perhaps also the world that had forced her to live in shadows. Yet, even in death, Anne remained partially hidden. Her funeral was private, her grave modest. The public mourning that would accompany the death of any other child of France's leader was muted, constrained by the same social pressures that had kept her hidden in life. French newspapers mentioned her death only briefly, referring to her as the youngest daughter of General de Gaulle who had been in poor health. No mention of Down syndrome, no acknowledgement of the life she had lived or the joy she had brought to her family. It was only after her death that Anne's impact truly began to be felt. Her mother, Yvonne de Gaulle, channeled her grief into action, founding the foundation Anne de Gaulle, dedicated to supporting children with disabilities. It was as if Anne's death finally gave her family permission to acknowledge publicly what they had always known privately, that she mattered, that children like her deserved support and recognition, that hiding them away was not protection but a form of slow violence. But for every Anne de Gaulle, partially hidden but genuinely loved, how many others were there who found neither love nor even basic human dignity? The institutions of Europe and America were filled with children whose only crime was being born different in families that couldn't tolerate difference. The Royal Earlswood Hospital, where the Bowes-Lyon sisters spent their lives, was considered one of the better institutions. Yet, even there, conditions were often appalling. Return now to Earlswood in 1941, where Nerissa and Katherine are beginning their new lives as non-people. The admissions process is deliberately dehumanizing. Their fine clothes are taken, silk dresses and cashmere sweaters that will be burned rather than donated, lest someone recognize their quality and ask questions. They are stripped, examined, their bodies cataloged for defects with the same clinical detachment used for livestock. They are issued institutional clothing, rough gray dresses that will be their uniform for decades, marked with numbers rather than names. Imagine the daily reality for Nerissa and Katherine. They wake not to the gentle ministrations of nursemaids, but to the harsh efficiency of overworked institutional staff. The dormitory is a vast room filled with iron beds, each exactly 18 inches from the next. Privacy is non-existent. The sounds of 40 women sleeping, crying, moaning, talking to themselves create a constant cacophony that makes real rest impossible. At 5:30 a.m., the lights flip on with industrial brightness. Those who don't rise immediately are pulled from their beds. Breakfast is porridge, gray and lukewarm, eaten with hundreds of others in a dining hall that echoes with the sounds of distress. Some patients rock back and forth, others moan wordlessly. Many simply stare at nothing. The sisters who once ate off fine china with silver spoons now use battered metal implements and plates that have served thousands of forgotten souls before them. The porridge is often lumpy, sometimes sour, always insufficient. Hunger becomes a constant companion. The days stretch endlessly. There are no tutors here, no attempts at education. The prevailing wisdom of the era says that idiots and imbeciles, the cruel clinical terminology of the time, cannot learn, so why try? Instead, there is occupational therapy of the most basic kind. Sorting buttons, rolling bandages, simple repetitive tasks designed more to pass time than develop skills. The sisters who might have learned to read, to write, to express themselves, are instead taught only to be quiet and compliant. The workshop where they spend their days is a warehouse of wasted potential. Women who might have been artists weave the same basket patterns day after day. Women who might have been musicians are allowed no instruments. Women who might have been mothers are sterilized without their consent. The institution's way of ensuring that defectives don't breed. Nerissa and Katherine sit at a long table, their fingers working automatically to sort buttons by size. White, black, brown, over and over, hour after hour, year after year. Recreation time is spent in a walled courtyard where patients walk in circles or sit on benches staring at the walls. There are no books, no games, no activities that might stimulate the mind or bring joy. The sisters stay close together, a unit of two in a sea of isolation. They develop their own communication, gestures and expressions that only they understand. A private language born of shared abandonment. Visits from family are non-existent. This is not unusual. Many families, having placed their defective relatives in institutions, prefer to forget they exist. But for Nerissa and Katherine, the abandonment is particularly acute because their family continues to appear in newspapers, on television, in the public eye. In the day room, where patients are sometimes allowed to watch television, they might catch glimpses of their cousins at royal events, might recognize faces they once knew, now aged and important. Do they understand who these people are? Do they remember their connection? The staff doesn't know and doesn't ask. It's easier to assume the patients understand nothing. Christmas at Earlswood is perhaps the cruelest time. The institution makes token efforts. A tree in the dining hall, paper decorations made by patients. A special meal that is only marginally better than usual. Local church groups sometimes visit to sing carols, their voices bright with forced cheer as they perform for an audience that responds with silence, tears, or occasional screaming. The visitors leave quickly, duty done, returning to their normal lives where children are treasured and families gather in warmth. For Nerissa and Katherine, Christmas means watching other patients receive visits, small gifts, proof that someone, somewhere, remembers they exist. The sisters have each other, but no one else. They sit together during the carol service, perhaps remembering Christmases from their childhood, trees decorated with golden ornaments, presents wrapped in silk ribbons, family gatherings where they were, if not fully included, at least present. Now they are ghosts at their own feast, forgotten by everyone who shares their blood. The medical care at Earlswood is basic at best, negligent at worst. Patients with Down syndrome often have heart conditions, thyroid problems, and other health issues that require monitoring and treatment. But the institutional doctors, overwhelmed by the sheer number of patients and limited by the prejudices of their time, provide only the most basic care. Infections spread rapidly through the overcrowded wards. Dental problems go untreated until teeth simply fall out. Mental health issues, depression, anxiety, trauma from institutionalization itself, are ignored entirely or treated with sedatives that leave patients zombified. The sisters age prematurely in this environment. Photographs from their admission show two young women with the round faces and almond eyes characteristic of Down syndrome, but also with a vitality, a spark that suggests intelligence and personality. By the 1960s, that spark has dimmed. They move more slowly, their faces marked by the resignation of those who have learned that tomorrow will be exactly like today, and today is not worth living. The cruelest twist comes in how they are remembered, or rather, not remembered. When Nerissa dies in 1986, she is buried in a pauper's grave, marked only with a plastic tag bearing a serial number. This woman, cousin to the Queen of England, descendant of Scottish nobility, is laid to rest with less dignity than a stranger would receive. The institution notifies no family. After all, according to official records, she's been dead since 1963. Her body is disposed of with the same efficiency used for all unclaimed patients, a final erasure of a life that was never allowed to be lived. It's only when journalists discovered the deception in 1987 that a proper headstone is hastily erected, not out of genuine feeling, but to minimize scandal. The stone bears only her name and dates. No mention of her connection to royalty. No acknowledgement of the decades of abandonment. Even in death, the family maintains its distance, issuing statements through spokespersons about difficult decisions made in different times, and the best interests of all concerned. The discovery of the sisters' existence and their false deaths sends shockwaves through British society. How could this happen? How could the royal family, that symbol of stability and tradition, have perpetrated such a deception? The palace's response is telling in its carefully crafted neutrality. These were not members of the immediate royal family, they note, as if distance of relationship somehow justifies decades of abandonment and lies. But the public reaction reveals something important. Times have changed. What was once acceptable, even expected, the hiding away of imperfect children, now strikes people as monstrous. The very institutions that once housed society's unwanted are being exposed for the hellholes they often were. Documentaries begin appearing, showing the conditions inside places like Earlswood, the overcrowding, the neglect, the waste of human potential. The disability rights movement is gaining strength. Parents of children with Down syndrome are demanding education, inclusion, and recognition for their children. They form support groups, lobby for legislation, challenge the medical establishment that still recommends institutionalization. Katherine, still alive in 1987 when the scandal breaks, becomes an unwitting symbol of changing attitudes. Journalists attempt to visit her, to give her the attention she was denied for so long, but the institution refuses access. She is too fragile, they say, too set in her routines to handle disruption. The truth is likely more complex. After decades of institutionalization, Katherine has become what the system made her: dependent, isolated, unable to cope with a world she was never allowed to know. She continues to live at Earlswood, then at Keighlin House when Earlswood closes, still officially dead according to Burke's peerage, still unvisited by family. Staff members who care for her report that she is gentle, quiet, attached to routine. She likes music, they say, becoming animated when songs from the 1940s play on the radio. Perhaps they remind her of something, some glimpse of the life she might have had. She dies in 2014 at the age of 86, having spent 72 years in institutions, her entire adult life erased from official existence. The world that created Nerissa and Katherine's tragedy is dying, though not quickly enough. Across Europe and America, the great institutions are closing. Their residents moved to smaller facilities or group homes. The medical understanding of Down syndrome has advanced dramatically. Early intervention programs help children with Down syndrome reach potentials that would have seemed impossible in 1941. People with Down syndrome are increasingly visible in media, in workplaces, in communities. Yet, even as we condemn the actions of past generations, we must ask uncomfortable questions about our own. How many children with disabilities are still hidden away? If not in institutions, then in back bedrooms, kept from school, from community, from life? In some countries, prenatal testing for Down syndrome leads to termination rates above 90%. Are we more accepting, or have we simply found more efficient ways to ensure that people with Down syndrome are never born? How many families still feel shame rather than pride in their children who are different? How many societies still value perfection over diversity, normality over the beautiful variety of human existence? The royal families of history held up a mirror to their society's values, and what we see reflected is not flattering. When the powerful could so easily discard their own children for the crime of being different, what hope did ordinary families have of doing better? When even love wasn't enough to overcome the fear of social judgment, what does that say about the societies that created such fear? The institutions that housed people with disabilities were not anomalies. They were logical extensions of societies that saw human worth as conditional, that valued conformity over compassion, that preferred hiding problems to solving them. Every grand asylum built to warehouse the defective was a monument to collective failure, an admission that we didn't know how to, or didn't want to, include everyone in the human family. But history is not just a catalog of cruelties, it's also a record of progress, however slow and incomplete. Today, people with Down syndrome are increasingly visible, valued, and included. They attend mainstream schools, hold jobs, get married, advocate for themselves and others. They act in television shows, compete in Special Olympics, start businesses, and contribute to their communities in countless ways. They are no longer hidden but celebrated, no longer erased but embraced. This transformation didn't happen overnight, and it didn't happen without struggle. Every child with Down syndrome who attends a regular school represents a battle fought by parents who refuse to accept institutional wisdom. Every adult with Down syndrome who holds a job represents employers who chose inclusion over exclusion. Every person with a Down syndrome who lives independently represents a society slowly learning that different doesn't mean less capable, just differently capable. Consider how different Nerissa and Katherine's lives might have been if they had been born today. Instead of Earlswood's gray walls, they might have attended school with support services tailored to their needs. Early intervention programs would have helped them develop communication skills. Physical therapy would have strengthened their muscles. Occupational therapy would have taught them life skills. They might have learned to read using methods designed for visual learners, to write using assistive technology, to express themselves through art or music or dance. Instead of make-work occupational therapy, they might have pursued genuine interests and developed real skills. Many people with Down syndrome work in offices, restaurants, retail stores, and other businesses. Some run their own companies. They contribute to their communities not as objects of pity, but as valued members. Nerissa might have worked in a library, organizing books with the same attention to detail she once applied to sorting buttons. Katherine might have worked in a nursery, caring for plants with the gentleness that institutional life never let her express. Instead of isolation from their family, they might have been included in gatherings, their accomplishments celebrated rather than their existence denied. Modern royal families include members with various disabilities. Prince John of the United Kingdom, who had epilepsy, was hidden away in the early 20th century, but today's royals are more open about health challenges and developmental differences. The shame that once surrounded disability is slowly, too slowly, giving way to acceptance and even pride. Instead of dying forgotten, they might have lived remembered, valued, loved. They might have had friends beyond each other, relationships that enriched their lives, connections to communities that saw them as whole people rather than problems to be solved. They might have traveled, experienced different cultures, contributed their unique perspectives to a world that desperately needs diverse voices. The tragedy is not that they had Down syndrome. The tragedy is that they lived in a world that saw their Down syndrome as incompatible with human dignity. The tragedy is that their family's fear of judgment outweighed their capacity for love. The tragedy is that two women who might have lived full, meaningful lives instead spent decades in institutional limbo, officially dead while actually alive, erased from history while still drawing breath. Their story forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about how societies treat those they deem imperfect. It's easy to judge the royal families of the past for their cruelty, but harder to acknowledge that they were products of their time, acting according to social norms that valued conformity over diversity, perfection over humanity. Every era believes itself more enlightened than those that came before, yet every era has its own blindness, its own cruelties disguised as common sense. Today, we medicalize what we once moralized. Instead of seeing disability as divine punishment, we see it as medical tragedy. Instead of hiding people with disabilities in institutions, we sometimes hide them through selective abortion or segregated education. Instead of declaring them officially dead, we sometimes act as if their lives are not worth living. The language has changed, become more clinical and less obviously cruel, but have the underlying attitudes transformed as much as we'd like to believe? These questions become more urgent as genetic testing becomes more sophisticated. We can now detect Down syndrome and many other conditions before birth. This knowledge brings power, but power without wisdom can lead to new forms of eugenics, more subtle but no less devastating than the old. When we can choose which lives come into existence, we must ask ourselves, what are we choosing and why? Are we preventing suffering, or are we preventing diversity? Are we exercising compassion, or are we succumbing to the same fears that led royal families to hide their imperfect children? The answer is not simple. Parents facing these decisions deserve support, not judgment. But as a society, we must ensure that our choices are based on accurate information about what life with Down syndrome can be, not on outdated stereotypes or fears. We must create a world where choosing to have a child with Down syndrome is not seen as tragedy, but as choosing a different kind of journey, challenging but also rewarding. The royal children hidden away for their disabilities represent more than individual tragedies. They represent systemic failures of compassion, systematic denials of humanity. They represent what happens when image matters more than truth, when conformity matters more than diversity, when fear matters more than love. They represent choices made not just by individuals, but by entire societies that created the conditions where such choices seemed reasonable, even necessary. But they also represent resilience. Despite everything done to erase them, we know their names. Despite decades of official death, their stories survive. Despite society's best efforts to forget them, we remember. Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon, Princess Alexandrine of Prussia, and de Gaulle. These names now stand as testimony to survival against overwhelming odds, to humanity that persists even when systematically denied. As we remember these forgotten children, we must ask ourselves what hidden children exist in our own time. Who are we failing to see? Who are we erasing from our collective story? Who are we condemning to lives of shadow and silence because their existence makes us uncomfortable? The answers to these questions are not comfortable, but they are necessary, because every child deserves to be seen, valued, and loved, not in spite of their differences, but because of them. Every person deserves to have their story told, their life acknowledged, their death mourned. Every family deserves support in raising children who don't fit society's narrow definitions of normal. and every society deserves to benefit from the contributions of all its members, not just those who meet arbitrary standards of perfection. The palaces where these children were born still stand, monuments to power and privilege. Tourists walk through their gilded halls, admiring the portraits of kings and queens, princes and princesses who shaped history. But the real monuments to these forgotten lives are not in stone and gold, but in the slow transformation of attitudes, the gradual recognition of human dignity, the ongoing struggle for inclusion and acceptance. Every time a child with Down syndrome is welcomed into a classroom instead of hidden away, these forgotten royal children are honored. Every time a person with disabilities is seen as fully human rather than as a problem to be solved, their memory is vindicated. The crown jewels glitter in their cases, symbols of royal power and continuity. But the real treasures of these royal lines were the children they threw away, the lives they deemed unworthy, the people they chose to forget. In remembering them now, in speaking their names and telling their stories, we restore a small measure of the dignity they were denied. We cannot undo the past, but we can ensure its lessons shape a better future, one where every child, regardless of ability, is seen as the treasure they truly are. The last of the hidden royal children we know about, Katherine Bowes-Lyon, died in 2014. She had spent nearly 70 years in an institution, forgotten by the family that should have cherished her, erased from the records that should have acknowledged her, hidden from the world that should have known her. Her death marked the end of an era, not because such practices have entirely ended, but because the silence that once surrounded them has been broken. The shame has shifted from those who were hidden to those who did the hiding. The tragedy is no longer in being born different, but in a world that couldn't accept difference. Today, when a royal baby is born, the world watches through social media and 24-hour news coverage. Every detail is scrutinized, every milestone celebrated. It would be almost impossible now for a royal family to hide a child with disabilities the way they once did. But visibility is not the same as acceptance, and acknowledgement is not the same as inclusion. The work of ensuring that every child is valued continues, in royal nurseries and ordinary homes, in parliaments and playgrounds, wherever children are born and lives are shaped. As we close this dark chapter of royal history, let us remember not just the cruelty, but the lives that persisted despite it. Somewhere in Earlswood's drafty halls, two sisters held hands and comforted each other through decades of abandonment. Somewhere in Prussia, a princess played piano pieces she would never perform publicly, but which brought her private joy. Somewhere in France, a general held his daughter and saw not her disability but her soul. These moments of humanity amid inhumanity remind us that love can persist even in the darkest places, that dignity can survive even systematic attempts to destroy it, that the human spirit is resilient even when society fails it utterly. The royal children hidden for their disabilities were denied much, but they were not denied their fundamental humanity, no matter how hard their families and societies tried to erase it. Their stories, finally told, stand as testimony to all the hidden lives that history has swallowed. They remind us to look for the gaps in our records, the silences in our stories, the people our societies prefer to forget. They challenge us to create a world where no child needs to be hidden, where no life needs to be erased, where everyone can step into the light and be seen, valued, and loved for exactly who they are. In the end, these forgotten princes and princesses teach us that royal blood means nothing if it cannot embrace all its children, that palaces are prisons when they shut out those deemed imperfect, that crowns are hollow when they rest on heads that turn away from family members who need love most. The true nobility is not in bloodlines kept pure, but in hearts open wide enough to love without conditions, in societies brave enough to include everyone, in the recognition that every life, however different, however challenging, has inherent worth that no amount of shame or fear can diminish. The stories of Nerissa and Katherine Bowes-Lyon, of Princess Alexandrine, of Anne de Gaulle, and of countless others whose names we will never know, are finally being told. Not as footnotes to royal history, but as central chapters in the human story. Not as shameful secrets, but as calls to conscience. Not as ancient history, but as urgent reminders that the work of inclusion, acceptance, and love is never finished. Their lives, hidden for so long, now shine as beacons, guiding us toward a world where every child is treasured, every person is valued, and every life is lived in the light.